Discussions in Depth Psychology is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. Your host is Bonnie Bright. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discussions in Depth Psychology, which is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Bonnie Bright, and I'm also a graduate of the Depth Psychology program at Pacifica. And this series is really intended to highlight and focus on the work and research of those who are engaged with depth psychological practices and who are wanting to look at various topics through a depth psychological lens. I'm here today with a very special guest, Jonathan Erickson, who is a writer and a life coach based in the Los Angeles area. And Jonathan has done some absolutely fascinating research on elephants, which we're going to hear more about. So first of all, welcome to the program, Jonathan. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm very excited about this topic because I have always had, as many of us do, I think, a real fascination for animals, but elephants in particular seem to be really interesting because there's a lot of sort of pop mythology stories and narratives about them. And if you actually just go and Google or look at YouTube with elephants and emotions, you can see that a lot of these kinds of topics come up. So it's going to be really juicy, I think, to hear more about the research and exactly how you apply that from a depth psychological lens. But let me first read your bio, Jonathan, so that everybody has a better background on you, and then we'll jump right in.
Okay.
Jonathan is a writer and life coach, as I mentioned, and he's based in the Los Angeles area. And he holds a master's degree in somatic depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, where he's now writing a doctoral dissertation on the neuroscience of imagination. Jonathan is a lifelong animal lover who completed his Ph.D. fieldwork at Pacifica by researching human-elephant relationships in Cambodia. So I think that sets the stage for us, Jonathan. I know that you specifically were focused on elephants during the fieldwork project, and so maybe you can ease us into that topic by talking a little bit about where your interest first came in elephants.
Well, I've always been fascinated by intelligent animals, highly intelligent animals of all kinds, and I had been in Southeast Asia the year prior and had heard about this elephant sanctuary, but I wasn't able to go visit it at the time. It's the Elephant Valley Project in Cambodia, and what really caught my attention about them is that they take this really profoundly ethical stance that people don't ride the elephants. The elephants aren't there to serve anyone. The elephants aren't there for the humans. The elephants are there to just get to live out their lives in peace and to be elephants, essentially. And that was the whole idea of the sanctuary and the ethos behind it. And so in thinking about what kind of fieldwork I wanted to do, it occurred to me that I could actually go and study what was actually happening in a sanctuary where elephants were really being treated with respect. And the more I thought about it, the more I became tremendously excited that this was actually something that I could do. And as you mentioned earlier, as you start to get into elephant research, it's really a rabbit hole. There's so much there, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's very true. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that you, of course, are finishing your Ph.D. in the Somatics program there at Pacifica. And so I'm wondering what the correlation was that you saw initially between the Somatics and the things that you happen to be learning and studying in that program at Pacifica and the work that you proposed to do with the elephants.
Right. So one of my premises going into this in looking at human-elephant relationships and human-elephant communication, that was really what I was focused on. We know that elephants don't have abstract language in the way that we do. So whatever ways they have of thinking, of being, and of communicating, it's going to be different. But one thing that we do share with elephants is that we are embodied beings, right? We have bodies. We have to live out our lives in bodies. We communicate through bodies. We make contact as bodies. And that's what somatics is all about. It's the study of embodiment. What does it mean to be an embodied human? And so the question of what does it mean to be an embodied elephant, I thought was a very interesting point of intersection between the two species. It's something that we really do share, in contrast to the language problem in terms of abstract language. So it opens up whole new venues for approaching elephants through gesture, through touch, through empathy. Some of these more embodied, when we talk about having an embodied response to each other as humans, we'll have, a gut feeling, we'll have emotional resonance, we'll have a sense of attunement. And I was very curious to see how those ideas might be applied when dealing with another intelligent species who are different from us, but who also have some important similarities in that regard.
Yes, it's so fascinating. And of course, when I think about elephants, or when I actually feel into more what the embodiment of an elephant might be myself, I can't help, but think about their trunk, because it's just such a unique feature that they have that we don't see in other animals per se. And I'm particularly thinking about a lot of the videos that I've seen of elephants and how they're able to use that trunk in various ways. And one way that I saw recently, actually, if you Google or look for a video on YouTube, was something that was going around social media recently, and it was a video of an elephant that was actually painting. And the elephant had the brush in its trunk, and it had an easel in front of it, and it was literally making a painting of an elephant who was putting a flower up. I don't know if you've seen this, but it just struck me. And you had mentioned how animals are so highly intelligent, particularly elephants. But I wonder if you can say more about that capacity for art itself and how that might apply to some of the research that you did.
Well, that is a somewhat controversial thing, the elephants who are actually painting pictures of elephants. It's controversial on a couple different levels. One level of controversy is that those elephants are very highly trained. They receive a lot of very specific cues. So it's not necessarily a self-expression in the sense that if you just gave an elephant a paintbrush and had it paint something, that it would be drawing those sorts of shapes. It was years ago in Berkeley, I went to an exhibit at a museum that was of elephant paintings that had been created just sort of freeform. They were very abstract and messy, but they were also totally fascinating to look at, to see what an elephant would do creatively. But I have some ethical issues with the way elephants are trained and treated and forced to perform. And when you look at those videos of the painting, it raises some of those questions of is this elephant being forced to do this? How is it trained? How is it being treated? So it's a tricky thing to talk about, because on the one hand, it captures the heart, right? We see that and we're like, oh my gosh, this sensitive being is creating this thing. And I do think that it's true insofar as elephants are sensitive and highly intelligent and capable of expressing all sorts of things. But at the same time, the actual situation under which those paintings are taking place, that's a little questionable in my opinion.
And see, that's exactly the kind of thing that I think really bears looking at through a depth psychological lens or an eco-psychological lens, because this is something that, from my perspective, and I'm sure from a lot of people, it's really easy to project what we want to see onto these kinds of things. And right. I don't know, to your point, I don't know if we actually know to what extent an animal like an elephant, or this particular elephant that's featured in the video, knows that it's painting another elephant, or if it was just taught to maybe make the form as you're suggesting. But I think that there's a real longing, on my part at least, to want to sort of be able to enter or find that common ground between us and the other animals that inhabit this planet. Do you have some experiences of your own while you were working there in Cambodia where you actually felt like you were able to access that field or enter that field and really begin to engage with animals on a different level than we typically see?
Yes, I would say so. And one of the reasons I had to go all the way to Cambodia was because Cambodia is kind of a lawless land. I was actually able to go and be with the elephants and touch them and, have real interaction with them, which even in the United States now, zookeepers, for the most part, are not allowed to have direct contact with elephants. And to a certain degree, you have to approach each elephant as an individual, right? Each elephant has its own history. Some elephants get along better with other elephants, and some elephants are going to get along better with certain people, right? So it was different from one elephant to another. Different elephants were interested in interacting with me in different ways. And when I think about the elephant that I had the most connection with, it was always through touch that I felt the most connection. Being able to make tactile contact was a really beautiful way to connect and to engage with a palpable sense of their intelligence. And also the other piece, which we haven't discussed, is they have a capacity for infrasonic communication, which is they can communicate with vibration that's outside of the auditory range of human beings. But there's this middle ground where the vibration is very, very deep and low, but we can still pick it up. And the way I would actually feel this resonating in my body, I could be like all the way across the field, and I would feel my chest cavity vibrating when they would rumble. And then even more so when I was making physical contact, touching an elephant's forehead, and she would rumble at me. and to feel that vibration moving out of her body and into mine and sort of rattling my bones a little bit was just a very, I don't still quite have the words to describe it, but it was really a profound moment of feeling like she and I were sharing this common space that was beyond language.
That's a beautiful story. And it does serve, I think, on hearing it, to allow me to imagine on some level what that might have been like to actually experience that and to be in that kind of communication with elephants. So that's an obvious example of one way that elephants communicate, which is quite different, I'd say, than human communication. Were there others that you found?
Yeah, so there's some communication with gesture, and there are various ideas about what universal gestures mean between elephants and what sort of gestures elephants will use towards humans, trunk moving this way or that way, ears flaring, etc. They have a wide variety of vocal calls. I think Joyce Poole has documented over 200 different kinds of sounds that they make, and they can be very chatty with each other, particularly when they're first getting together at the beginning of the day. They're very tactile. They love to touch each other, and they do a lot of communication through touch. So then there's this infrasonic thing, which is fascinating. One of the things that's fascinating about it is that apparently it can take place over vast distances, so they can actually communicate. It's almost like a long-distance communication, or seems to be, that elephants in distant locations will somehow be able to receive information about what's happened to a different herd. It's somewhat speculative, but we do know that these vibrations move vast distances, and it does seem like elephants are picking up information out of the ethers. So this is one of the theories that's been advanced about what's happening there. And then the last channel of communication that they have, which is probably most alien to us, is chemical communication. You'll see they're constantly putting their trunks in each other's mouths. And again, humans have all sorts of ways of interpreting what this means, but part of what's going on there is a chemical exchange. And so quite likely there's some sort of chemical response that goes on between them, and that chemistry contains information which is probably unique to that particular moment, right? It can probably mean all sorts of different things. It's just a way of checking in with each other. And that's even harder to imagine, I think, for humans to understand just communicating through chemistry. So in that sense, they really are quite alien beings, and all the more fascinating for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it reminds me of something that I heard regarding communication about a particular people, I think, who were in Mongolia. And basically the idea was that it's so cold where they live all the time that they have actually developed their own language that is by touch, so that when they clasp hands in greeting for each other, their fingers actually are able to slide right inside the wrist area, and they have a system of touch and tapping where they can communicate so that they don't have to uncover their faces and talk. And I just found that so fascinating. And what you're saying, it reminds me of this. And it just also, I think, points to the way that our minds can just be expanded in such unique ways by looking across species to see what other species do, and I mean, even people that are different than us, the way that we were raised in traditional Western culture. And so I really love that about it, because it does expand my mind. It does help me to understand and look at things from a different perspective. And of course, to me, that's primarily what depth psychology is about, being able to look under the surface of things, or from different perspectives, or at the marginalized things, and be able to understand them. This whole idea of transspecies ethnography has been around for a while. What other resources and lenses did you use as you were out there in the field?
Well, so transspecies ethnography is an approach to interspecies communities, right, where there are multiple species cohabitating, that rather than going the traditional natural science route of trying to be completely objective, in an ethnography, anthropologists have learned that there has to be an element of relationship involved, that if you really want to understand a different culture, you have to participate in that culture. And so from the field of anthropology, we have this idea of the participant observer who goes into a community and observes and is able to retain some objectivity, but balances that with relationship and with participation. And in fact, early anthropology, there was a lot of criticism that because this wasn't happening, because it was all totally quote-unquote objective, that it was actually part and parcel with cultural imperialism and the colonial project of Western cultures sort of moving in because they weren't actually communicating with the other cultures they were studying. They were just imposing their ideas while telling themselves they were being objective about it. So the idea with the transspecies ethnography is to be willing to approach animals just as an alternative way, right? Let's just approach this from some different perspectives here. To be willing to approach animals, particularly intelligent animals, and particularly intelligent animals that are in communities that involve multiple species, from that perspective of being a participant observer rather than just an observer. And what that opens up is the possibility of relationship and an affirmation of relationship as a source of valuable information, which is something we now expect when we're researching human cultures. But when it comes to something like an elephant culture or, say, dolphin culture, and I use this word culture very deliberately because we think that can't be cultures for humans. But I would say that if you have a very intelligent social group of animals, like dolphins, like chimpanzees, like elephants, we should at least be willing to consider it from that perspective and do some research from that perspective and see what that can teach us.
That's beautiful. I love that. And I agree with you. There should be more of that. And from some standpoint, I guess, I look at it and I think, how could there not be a culture when you start considering what exactly is happening with them? And of course, again, we've had so much evidence, particularly I feel like in the last few decades, about how animals are not only highly intelligent, but also highly social, as you mentioned, and also just able to really feel and be involved emotionally. So let's talk a little bit about that in the time that we have left, because to me that's such a critical piece of this whole thing, and that is the capacity for animals to feel emotion, which of course I think most scientists acknowledge at this point. Unfortunately, there were some dark ages there where we really didn't believe that, and of course all kinds of horrible experiments and things came out of those days. But what about elephants? Because they're really known for their not only capacity, but their propensity toward grieving in particular and mourning their own dead. And there's stories about what they do with elephant bones when they come across them. So can you say more about that?
Yeah, well, of course, I didn't get to actually observe that myself in the field, but I've seen those videos, and it is one of the most striking things about elephants and about wild elephant culture out in the wilds of Africa in particular, the way that they will really pause in this very reflective manner when they come to the bones of a dead elephant. And there's such a sensitivity that the footage I've seen is that they'll very gently stroke the bones. There seems to be a real appreciation, maybe a sense of searching. We can never know exactly what they're thinking or even how they're thinking, but there's an awareness there, and there's a sense of solemnity and importance to the interactions with these bones. And as far as I know, that's unparalleled anywhere else in the animal kingdom. That the only other animals that do that are humans, as far as I know. And it certainly does make a very strong case in the case of elephants for viewing them as a non-human culture and not just as another species. Another thing that is fascinating about elephants is it doesn't happen all the time, but they also are known to adopt orphans. So if there's a baby that's been separated from its mother or from its herd, they will take that baby on. And from a strictly evolutionary perspective, if you're looking through the paradigm of strict Darwinian survival of the fittest, that doesn't make any sense. And yet there's a sensitivity and a sense of caring so that if they can take that baby and provide it with nourishment and warmth and society, they will do so. And I think that's another really beautiful example of how they transcend what we usually think of as animal behavior.
Right. And then the other thing that I've seen, I think that kind of relates to that, is also their own tendency to mourn their own lost ones, particularly when a mother loses a baby elephant. It seems like she's almost unable to move on, and they actually seem to be crying, which probably doesn't surprise a lot of people that are listening to this. But it just is such a big thing when you really begin to start thinking about it, just how involved they very likely are and able to understand and appreciate the loss that has occurred to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and looking at their whole social structure, it becomes more and more apparent that they are creatures of community. They are creatures of relationship. They care for each other. They love each other. They appreciate each other. And so, of course, there is tremendous loss and tremendous mourning and tremendous anger, too. That's something that doesn't get talked about as much, but elephants can become outraged, and they can become very dangerous when they've been wronged or hurt or seen their loved ones hurt.
This is so fascinating. It's really just continuing to expand my own thinking around, being able, I think, to look at myself and also be able to look at what we often call, or what Jung referred to as, the other. And I put that in quotation marks because In our lives, we often are so binary that we look at self and then we have the boundary and then we look at anything that's different or not like us. And of course, the real benefit of depth psychology or taking a depth psychological perspective is really being able to look and regard that other and begin to understand how that actually integrates or plays a role in our own lives. So I've heard a little bit about some of the things that you've learned and the experiences that you've had. What about the challenges of doing this kind of field work? You must have run across some things that were not necessarily as easy in your work.
Well, I think the biggest challenge was cultural pushback from other humans who were invested in viewing animals in general and then including elephants in that category, viewing them as just, however you want to put it, putting them down on this lower level. They are just objects. They are just animals. They're not really intelligent. They're not really conscious, emotional, sensitive beings. So certainly there were a lot of visitors at the sanctuary who seemed very married to those ideas and who actually became visibly, they didn't want to hear what I had to say. The fact that I was trying to approach this from a perspective of relationship and communication, I had the impression that for some people that was quite threatening because they were very attached to thinking about animals in this different way. And even with the staff, and particularly the director of the sanctuary, I was actually a little shocked at the degree to which he would employ pretty strict behaviorist language and perspectives in terms of how the elephants should be managed and talking about their behaviors. And I never really figured out if he was doing it because he felt like he had to, because that was the cultural expectation and he has to use this behaviorist scientific language in order to be taken seriously, or if he really truly believes it. I know that he cares about the elephants deeply, and I know that all of the staff there had come to care about the elephants very deeply, and they would occasionally tell some fantastic story about elephant abilities, elephant intelligence, which I think hinted at a broader view of what was going on. But I do think that our ideas about animals in the West have been that they are less than us, that they are objects, that their consciousness is questionable, is so deeply entrenched, and it can be very threatening to push back against that for some people. And in a ethnographic research situation where you're trying to not just understand the elephants, but also understand the humans, it's a tricky balancing act to want to listen and affirm what these other humans are saying and to make space for that, even though it seems to be destructive towards the elephants in some way, or that it seems to be carrying forward cultural assumptions about the elephants that I would personally like to see us move beyond.
Right. Yeah, you and me both, for sure. Yeah. Well, it sounds like an amazing experience to be able to actually go and work so closely with the elephants. I'm sure you probably never imagined in a million years that when you were assigned essentially to do field work as part of the program at Pacifica, that's where you would end up. Or maybe you did, but I wonder as we come to a close here, how you would say that working with the elephants through this field work has changed your life. What have you taken away from this, Jonathan?
Well, to be perfectly honest, it feels like unfinished business for me. I feel like I've had a deep love for animals my whole life. And even when I was a kid, I used to have fantasies about making documentaries about animals that sort of showed them from a more cultural perspective rather than from a strictly scientific perspective. And so it does feel like this was a wonderful opportunity to step into that fully in a much more actualized and professional way. And I'm deeply grateful for the experience and for everything it taught me. I hope to one day write a book about this, and I hope to find ways to continue to go back and work with the elephants and maybe also with dolphins. I've been always fascinated by dolphin intelligence, and there's actually been a lot more research into communication between humans and dolphins than humans and elephants. It seems to be a slightly newer discovery. So I think it's so important that this work goes on, and I would like to participate in it and contribute to it any way I can. And I think what you said earlier about otherness, that's it. That's right on the money. And of course, humans, we have so far to go just in being able to recognize the other in our fellow humans and deal with that. But I do think that as we start to get more of a handle on that, we are going to start turning towards our relationships with other species and having to reconcile those. And I think that there's going to be a lot of mourning involved in reconciling those relationships, and I think also a tremendous potential for growth and joy.
Well, that right there is maybe something that we can learn from the elephants, because they seem to do it so naturally and so well. And I agree with you.
Yeah.
It may not be an easy process as we begin to take into account what we have done in our relationships to the natural world. So it's wonderful to see the work that you're doing, Jonathan. I agree with you. It's a very, very important work. It's something that absolutely has to go forward as we strive to increase our own consciousness as the human race, and to begin to reconnect with some of those relationships that we have long since lost through the development of the Western psyche and the modernism and consumer-based psyche. So very exciting, very important work, and I just am so appreciative of what you're doing. I've been talking to Jonathan Erickson, who is a writer and life coach based in the Los Angeles area, and as we've been discussing, he completed his Ph.D. fieldwork at Pacifica by researching human-elephant relationships in Cambodia. Thank you again, Jonathan.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's been a real pleasure getting to talk to you about it.
You've been listening to Discussions in Depth Psychology, powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute with host Bonnie Bright.